Morning, everybody. My name is Peter Moss, and I'm an Emeritus Professor at the Thomas Coram Research Unit at UCL Institute of Education. And it's my privilege and pleasure to chair this morning's webinar on the urgency of slow, hosted by the Froebel Trust. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this event, and especially our overseas friends. Well, as the title suggests, our focus today is on slow, and in particular on slow knowledge, slow pedagogy, and slow practices in early childhood education. But the focus is set against a broader background, a global slow movement which has spread in the last 35 years or so to cover many aspects of life and society. A large number of people, about 740, have registered for this event, which suggests to me that the idea of slow attracts and resonates with many in the early childhood field. Now, if I read this correctly, then the appeal of slow is its potential for re-enchanting the field. Re-enchanting by rescuing early childhood from the grasp of an approach that is narrow and shallow, technical and instrumental, an approach that has obsessed successive governments here in England over many years in their search for the high economic returns they have been promised from early intervention. But slow is just one half of the title. The other is urgency. So why the urgency of slow? Alison Clark, whose research study is the starting point for this webinar, will share her views. But for me, it's about the pressing need for transforming early childhood in England, but possibly in other countries too. Transforming early childhood in England is in fact the title of a recent book edited by Claire Cameron and myself, and with chapters from 18 academics. And the conclusion that Claire and I come to in the book is that, and I'm quoting, early childhood education and care in England does not work for children or parents, workers or society. Nothing short of transformation is now needed to give young children the all-round upbringing they have a right to, and parents the support they need to both work and care. That urgent transformation, we argue, needs to cover the system, the values, and the pedagogy of early childhood education. Alison contributed a chapter to the book in which she made, and again I quote, the case that slow pedagogy, and in particular the concept of slow knowledge, pose a counter-cultural argument for change in early childhood education that has implications beyond the early years. The urgency of slow, then, for me, is that comprehensive transformation of early childhood is necessary and urgent. And an important part of that is a turn, an urgent turn, to slow pedagogy and slow knowledge. The urgency of slow is, in short, a provocation to think about what we want for all our children. Each presentation that follows Alison's opening session will challenge us to think about the topic of slow in different ways. Chris Pascal asks how we can learn from young children's experiences of the pandemic and the catch-up narrative. Gemma Patterson discusses slow practices in the everyday, focusing on meal times. Jo Albin Clark explores teaching slow with early childhood education students. And Sharon Khalils provokes us to think when to slow down and when to act. There are opportunities throughout for questions. At the end of the first part of the programme, briefly after each of the speakers in the second part, then at the end of the webinar, when we bring all the speakers together as a panel to consider a selection of your questions about slow and its urgency. So let us have your questions using the Q&A button. Right, let's get going. Our first speaker this morning is Alison Clark, who will tell us about her research study, Slow Knowledge and the Unhurried Child, which has been funded by the Froebel Trust. I've had the good fortune to work alongside Alison for more than 20 years, starting when she came to Thomas Coram Research Unit to develop a method for listening to very young children. That work led to the innovative mosaic approach, which has had worldwide recognition and application, a tribute to Alison's creativity, insight, and scholarship. She subsequently worked at Roehampton University, the Open University, and now the University of Southeastern Norway, where she has recently been awarded a professorship. So, with that introduction, I will hand over to Alison.
Thank you very much, Peter, and to every one of you for joining us this morning. So, the urgency of slow. And I'd like to start by thanking the Froebel Trust for hosting this webinar and for the funding of this study. So I'm going to start by showing you the shape of this talk that we'll begin. And it's going to go like this. So I'm just fiddling with my screen and the different views for a moment. Okay, so my talk is going to start with Froebel, to look at freedom from rote learning, to the slow movement, impatient schools, hurried child, proleptic time, slow pedagogies, slow knowledge, slow practices, listening, patient kindergarten, and then back to urgent. And then several of the issues I raise relate to the themes that will be explored by my colleagues, who I'm delighted have joined me today to mark this end of research study webinar. Slow is about the relationship with time. This dimension of early childhood practice has been an underexplored explicit discourse, I think, but when you start to look, is embedded in the early childhood field and was there explicitly in the first kindergartens as designed by Frederick Froebel. As Leibniz explains, both these notions of freedom from something, freedom from rote learning, and freedom from inappropriate teaching led Froebel to a more positive notion of freedom, namely freedom for children to participate, to choose, to act, to observe, to play, and above all, to be allowed time to absorb new knowledge at their own speed of learning. And I think for the focus today, to be allowed time to absorb new knowledge at their own speed of learning is really important. This is a theme that contemporary Froebelians have continued to follow. Helen Tovey explains, Froebelian educators create long periods of open-ended, uninterrupted time so that both children and adults can become deeply involved in play and other learning activities. Time is not filled, but is freed from all unnecessary interruptions. And then she continues, the use of adults' time is crucially linked to children's growing independence and autonomy. The availability of time is therefore a key feature of a Froebelian environment. And we see in Helen's comments here the link between children's time and their use of time and their agency, and also educators' time. The two are very much tied together. So here we can see time is not filled, but is freed. And I think that's a very interesting statement to think about. But slow has also become, but slow is often countercultural in education, in an increasingly time-pressured, measurement-focused system. So Maurice Holt, writing in 2002, declared it was time for a slow school movement. And this is what the editors of his articles said. The slow food movement began as a protest against the global proliferation of McDonald's restaurants. Mr. Holt calls for a similar backlash against today's hamburger approach toward uniformity, an education which emphasizes uniformity, predictability, and measurability of processes and results. So this conversation has been growing for several decades about acceleration and hurry in education in the global north. Gert Biester introduced another word, writing in 2012 to describe these educational systems. He uses the word impatient. Biester said, I am inclined to argue that what we find here is predominantly an impatient look. Not only do we find a desire to put as much world as possible into the child or student, we also find a desire to do this as quickly and cheaply as possible, to constantly monitor and measure the effectiveness and efficiency of the operation, to make teachers' salaries dependent on the extent to which they succeed in producing pre-specified learning outcomes. He continues, the impatience of society vis-à-vis the school, and we could say early childhood education as well, is therefore a sign of society's inability to give a place to the fundamental complexity and openness of all educational processes and practices. That is the fact that all education always and necessarily entails a risk. So, drawing on the work of the sociologist Hartmut Rosa, I ask these questions. Are we asking young children and those who work with young children to run ever faster to maintain their place and ours in the world? And then to look at what alternatives are there to be reclaimed, rooted in early childhood traditions, pedagogies, and practices. So these questions have underpinned my 2-year study, which started in January 2020. So it's involved these in-depth interviews with early childhood researchers, educators, and advisors across 11 countries: England, Scotland, Wales, Norway, Japan, Denmark, Portugal, Israel, USA, Canada, and Australia. And then during the first months of the study, I also ran a virtual reading group. Like many research studies that have started in 2020, working alongside the changes and the lockdowns through the pandemic has been one of the challenges here. And then a focus group of educators from England and Scotland met with me online to discuss the initial findings. And I'm so grateful to the Froebel Trust for the funding of this study. So, the hurried child. I first heard this phrase in conversation with a Japanese colleague, Mari Mori. The Hurried Child, Growing Up Too Fast and Too Soon was the title of a book written by the American psychologist David Elkind, first published in 1981. Another sign that these ideas are not new or concerns. And he was making the case for the pressure on children from parents, from schools, and the media. I subsequently interviewed Mari Mori, and this is part of our conversation. Mari said, well, the interesting thing is to hurry, there are two ways of interpreting it. Hurry means, well, to read and write, and also hurry means how to find a way in order to be successful in something, how to find out your talent. And then the parents and also corporations make investments, that kind of hurry. So two ways. Especially nowadays, for example, in sports, athletes can make a lot of money, soccer and that kind of thing, because in the mass media, it's always telling you about how much money that they can make. So they don't have an early childhood. A repeated theme through my interviews were examples of hurriedness, of the pressure of performativity in education, with an emphasis on testing and measurable results. And then the downward pressure on young children, what can be called the schoolification. So my next comment here is from Karina Gervin, who was one of the participants in my focus group, an early childhood educator for many years based in Scotland. And Karina explained, you're trying your best, but then you've got all this pressure from, well, it may be your local authority, it could be the Scottish government, it could be anybody. And then the tiny small fish, you're trying to fight back the bigger fish to say, no, you know, we're with these children. We've got the skills, we've got the knowledge, we've done the training, we know how to support these children. But ultimately, we are then almost forced to put them in boxes. And then when they get to school, it looks like those children aren't achieving when actually they are. So this downward pressure became a theme across my interviews. This is Emma Dyer, a teacher and researcher based in England, thinking about her experiences in the English system. So I suppose there's this pressure in schools to perform and to be able to do certain things at certain times, hit certain milestones at certain points. But then they're not necessarily developmental milestones, much more milestones in terms of what they can achieve or what they can demonstrate. So children are supposed to be reading fluently by the age of 6 and writing. And because the curriculum is so heavily reading and writing led in England, it filters back and back further and further back. So that idea of exploring slowly and doing all the sorts of things, doing a range of different things, I'm not saying it's gone, but then that pressure starts earlier and earlier. So I think this phrase back and back, it filters back and back, is really significant. And I think it can be a particular feature of early childhood education too. What Jewett and Jones have described as a proleptic organisation of time. And this is what they have to say in relation to secondary age pupils. And I think it's interesting to compare when we see this, to think about the young children that we're working with. So Jewett and Jones say, the examination itself, a year or so away, was constantly drawn to the attention of the students through spoken reminders, through handouts, and through wall displays. In this sense, we can speak of a proleptic organisation of time. The tasks of the lessons were described to students as anticipations of examination requirements. The final goal had a constant presence in the moment-to-moment activity of the lesson. When I first saw this, it made me think, so what final goal has a constant presence in the moment-to-moment activities in early childhood education? And I think issues of transition are one of those areas where this is very present. So even though Jewett and Jones are writing about secondary school students, I think this resonates with early childhood education in certain contexts, where what Peter Moss has described as readying or schoolification dominates the here and now, the moment to moment. In my interview with Claudie Tal, a researcher and early childhood teacher educator based in Israel, this idea of the filtering back and back came out again. And Claudie said, deep down in my heart, I don't very much like these instruments because I think that they drive people to being technical about early childhood education and about relationships with children. And in my opinion, nothing about education in general and early childhood education in particular should be technical. You should take the long way rather than the short way using instruments. It looks like taking the short way, but you're losing the meaning. So Claudie here is pointing to the measurement instruments used to assess young children and pointing out how technical these processes are and emphasizing the taking the long way rather than the short way. So I like this phrase, taking the long way. So this takes me to the next part of my research that has looked at reconsidering the relationship with time. So what might slow pedagogies look like, slow knowledge and slow practices? So this has been around reconsidering the relationship with time. So I would like to start here with an explanation from Sylvia Kind. Sylvia Kind is an instructor in early childhood education and care and an atelier-rista in Canada. And this is Sylvia thinking through her definitions of what slow pedagogies could look like. It is this idea of being with. I think that would be the essence of a slow pedagogy. And that being with isn't always slow in terms of time. Again, there could be intensities and vibrancies and things erupting. It's finding the rhythm of the children you're working with, the adults you're working with, the materials you're working with. It's how do we be with others, be with ideas, not just as if we stand outside of it. To me, I guess it was this idea of being with. So I think the key points for me here are a slow pedagogy can involve rapid, intense moments as well as the slow. And this reminds me of Deleuze and Guattari's phrase of looking for lines of flight. A slow pedagogy is attentive to the rhythm of children, but also the rhythm of educators and materials. And this is something that Sylvia and colleagues Veronica Puccini-Cacciabor describe in their ongoing research. But attentive to rhythm is also a phrase that came out of the slow movement in its early days as well. Not just looking for slow, but looking for the right rhythm. And a slow pedagogy makes time for listening and collaboration. Slow pedagogy celebrates the group as well as the individual. And Sylvia continues, describing the work in the studio where she's based. In studio work with children, particularly, that's the biggest thing that I'm working on, always cultivating a culture of thinking together and working together. That isn't something you can implement. It is something that can only be cultivated over time. You can't tell 3-year-olds easily, but you can cultivate a space where we're helping each other notice, working together, borrowing each other's ideas, noticing others, working with somebody else's ideas, instead of just assuming that everybody has their own idea. It's their idea, their image, their proposition, but once it's in the studio, it belongs to everybody and we can all engage with it. That cultivating a way of being together and thinking together, to me, is the primary work, even though all kinds of other artistic things happen and there might be other ideas, but that's the foundation of it all. Without that, I don't think we could do very much. So I think we see in this discussion, a slow pedagogy values the present moment. Slow pedagogy takes the long way, cultivating over time, not just aware of short-term goals. And to add to this, here is a comment from Solveig Nordtom, one of my Norwegian colleagues, who as a group have been very important in thinking about slow. So Solveig comments, I love the concept in between. So I think that in between could be one way of defining slow pedagogy, because this is a small space for wandering, for a pause. It's about thinking. In between is this magic space for possibilities and entanglements. Something can emerge without knowing how and to be prepared for it. So it's an alternative to this technical learning instrumental approach that if you use this, you will end up with this. This is how I think about slow pedagogy. It's not a way of doing it in a certain way, but it's open and it's ready for many possibilities. So to me, this emphasizes a slow pedagogy values the difficult to measure and the in-between. And then another sort of layer to this thinking about a slow pedagogy is the question of not shallow, but deep thinking. This is Mandy Bateman, as Mandy explains, a researcher and early childhood teacher educator, has been in Wales and now in New Zealand. And Mandy says, well, slow pedagogy in interactions between a teacher and child or children, where talk and gesture explore and ponder a concept of interest in great detail. It is less about linear time It doesn't have to be a sustained interaction, and more about full engagement in the flow of deep time. So here we have a thinking of slow and deep, in contrast to what Peter was saying in his introduction of narrow and shallow. So a summary has emerged in this study about a slow pedagogy. And I say a slow pedagogy and talk about slow pedagogies because I think this is not a one-size-fits-all. This is an open definition. A slow pedagogy can involve rapid, intense moments as well as a slowing down of pace. Slow pedagogy is attentive to the rhythm of the children, adults, and materials. Slow pedagogy makes time for listening and collaboration. Slow pedagogy celebrates the group as well as the individual. Slow pedagogy values play and the present moment. Slow pedagogy takes the long way, cultivating over time. Slow pedagogy values the difficult to measure, values process over outcome, and seeks to enable deep learning. So what about slow knowledge? Slow knowledge is a phrase that I first came across in David Orr's work. He is an environmentalist. And in this article, Slow Knowledge, he contrasts fast knowledge and slow knowledge. Now, I know there are dangers sometimes in thinking about binaries, but sometimes I think thinking in this way can help clarify what are the important characteristics of a phenomenon. So he says, fast knowledge deals with discrete things, slow knowledge deals with context, patterns, and connections. Fast knowledge is mostly linear, slow knowledge is complex and ecological. Fast knowledge is characterized by power and instability. Slow knowledge is known by its elegance, complexity, and resilience. These words, I think, are really significant in early childhood education at the moment, particularly around complexity, recognizing complexity and resilience. This is something that we want for our young children going forward into preparing them for very uncertain times. Fast knowledge is often abstract and theoretical, engaging only a portion of the mind. Slow knowledge engages all of the senses and the full range of our mental powers. Fast knowledge is always new. Slow knowledge is often very old. And I think there is a danger within the policy environments that always looking for the new, always looking for innovation, when actually sometimes we need to step back and think about the importance of what we already have. So I'm interested in an early childhood education that values knowledge that involves context, patterns and connections, is not afraid of complexity and is ecological, can be elegant and resilient, involves all of the senses and has room for old ideas alongside the new. So what do slow practices look like? And what are some of the theoretical perspectives that have informed their development? So drawing on my interviews, the following slow practices have emerged. Slow practices and play. So this has involved historical and contemporary examples of the special relationship between time and play. And we will hear more from Christopher Scal next about young children's experiences of the pandemic and the significance of time to play. And there are many connections with the Froebel annual lecture by Pasi Solberg. Slow practices in place has been around thinking here about both outdoor and indoor environments, including the very important aspect of young children's opportunities to enjoy repeated engagement with the place. Here I have considered slow pedagogy of place as discussed by the Australian academics, Payne and Watchor, in relation to environmental education, which is a very rich field for thinking about slow. And then slow practices with materials takes us to the specific environment, among other places, of the studio. And as we have heard from Sylvia Kind, slow practices here draw on arts education and also post-human and new materialist theories. A related topic is the subject of pedagogical documentation, which raises the question of the relationship between time and assessment. Multiple listening, as Carlina Rinaldi has described, is at the heart of pedagogical documentation, as developed in the preschools of Reggio Emilia. And multiple means there is an implicit need to make time and to slow down in order to revisit the documentation with young children and adults. And then slow practices in the everyday have taken me to consider phenomenological and philosophical ideas about the here and now, looking at attention to routines, to welcoming, to mealtimes, for example. And it's to the lunch table that Gemma Patterson will be taking us later. And then to slow practices and stories. So what opportunities do young children have to tell their own stories? Something which of course takes time, such as the helicopter story approach, based on the teachings of Vivian Gusson Paley, as adapted by Tricia Lee and Make Believe Arts. So this theme has included examples of how to teach slow to early childhood education students through repeated picture book reading, as developed by Claudie Tal in Israel. And Jo Alban Clark takes up teaching slow in higher education later this morning. And then in this open-ended list of slow practices, researching slow. So this brings me back to my earlier research studies developing and adapting the mosaic approach with Peter Ross, and here exploring this research framework through a temporal lens. So research processes that have listening to young children as a focus will involve a slowing down to some extent, especially in terms of finding inclusive methods and heightened awareness of cultural differences. So I'm so pleased that Sharon Colliers will be talking not only about slow, but about issues around inclusion and anti-racism that call for action. And this is a paradox, I think, in the title of this webinar, The Urgency of Slow. There is a paradox that slowing down can be what is required in order to grasp what is really important, what needs to happen next. Kirby, Parry and Lampert describe this paradox in their current work with HE students about the climate crisis in their work creating a forest food garden. So they say, recognizing that climate change is differentially experienced and entangled with everyday lives, we experiment creatively with the multiple ways of knowing, including the intuitive, experiential and emotional, as well as the rational. Paradoxically, this requires a slowing down to attend to feelings and perspectives as a means to identify what to transform together in response to the urgency of the environmental crisis. So I think this puts it so well, the paradox of thinking about slow and how it can lead us to the urgent. So what needs to happen next in early childhood education? Listening and slow raises the issue of what would patient early childhood education look like. Biesta's work suggests that a patient kindergarten would be one where there was time for recognizing difference or resistance, for uncertainty, for multiple voices, and I would add, for taking the long view. So in 2002, Maurice Holt called for the slow school movement. In 2012, Gert Biesta talks about the need for the slow and patient school. So in 2022 onwards, I think there is the case for celebrating slow and patient early childhood education, with the possibility for much discussion, collaboration, challenge, and disagreement along the way. I explore these and other ideas in the new book in the Routledge Contesting Early Childhood series that will be published later in 2022. Slow Knowledge and the Unhurried Child, Time for Slow Pedagogies in Early Childhood Education. And I'd like to end with a huge thanks to everyone who's been involved in this journey so far, to my research participants who have engaged so deeply with this topic, and for you all for listening. Thank you.
Well, Alison, thank you very much for giving us such both a clear and comprehensive account of your actually really important research project, but also setting it in a much wider context to show us really how the ideas about the slow movement, ideas about slow education have been gathering momentum over time, at the same time actually have their roots in much older pedagogical traditions. So I think you've got us off to a really good start, and there will be many questions, I'm sure, to come later to you about the project and about your thinking and about the concept of the patient kindergarten. That seems to me to be an excellent slogan for us all to be marching behind. So now we're going to move to our next speaker, who is Professor Chris Pascal, Director of the Centre for Research in Early Childhood in Birmingham. Chris will be well known to many of you, as she's been such a leading figure for many years in the field of early childhood in the United Kingdom, but also across Europe, where of course she's conducted comparative research, as well as being a founding member of the European Early Childhood Education Research Association, and indeed a former editor of that association's journal, the European Early Childhood Education Research Association Journal. So without more ado, I'll hand over to Chris to pick up the baton and continue the relay. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks very much, Alison, too, for such a wonderful start and setting the scene and the challenge to us all. I'm just going to hopefully share my screen with you. You just bear with me a moment. Okay, I hope that's there. So I'd like to begin too by thanking firstly the Froebel Trust, who funded and encouraged us to do this piece of work with a wonderful group of nurseries. And also thanks to the children and the families and the practitioners who worked with us on this piece of work I'm going to share with you at what was an extraordinary time. And to just the scene, we were doing this piece of action research during the last year, when the settings we were working with were going from lockdown to opening up to lockdown to opening up. So it was a very fraught and dynamic time. But in that time, the practitioners and the parents and children we work with were totally generous with their stories and narratives and experiences, and I hope felt very affirmed by having the opportunity to be, in Alison's terms, listened to very well, and their narratives kind of captured. And what's really important for me now is to make sure that something happens as a result of that gift they gave us of their narratives, that we think a little bit more about them and we try and push for action responding to them. And you know, the learning that's come from these very young children's experiences of living through that difficult time, and where we are now, which is, as has been said, we're into what the government calls a recovery agenda or a catch-up agenda. And I want to contest that a little bit and put the pause button on that and get us to think about where we go next. So I'm going to set it in a wider context, and to say that my own research and the wider research, I've been doing some work with the Sutton Trust and the Social Mobility Commission, and this research has fed into all of that wider research. But we absolutely understand now that the COVID pandemic has posed and continues to pose significant life challenges for all children, for all of us, but children are part of all of us. and especially those in vulnerable and less advantaged families. And when we look internationally, and we ran an EC era international conference on this, and published a cross-national special issue on it. And what became clear was, internationally, what the pandemic has done has shone a torch and illuminated the deep and entrenched inequalities in all our countries. The impact of the stresses and the social isolation, the dealing with the consequences of illness, and the disruption to family life. We know that has impacted profoundly on all children's well-being. And we have to be aware that this isn't magically going to disappear. It continues to act and will have long-term and deep consequences. So how do we think about that? What do we need to do? Because this generation of children have lived through an extraordinary time that we have a responsibility to kind of consider and act differently according to. It is a moment of disruption. And in a way, sometimes these moments of disruption historically are quite useful for us as society, because they do challenge us to think differently and think deeper about where we are. And the COVID pandemic is one strand of where we are in the 21st century. Climate change, sustainability, the mass migration that's going on. These are all parts of a discourse that's telling us that we haven't lived that well on the planet to this stage. And maybe it is time to have a rethink. And if I can think of that optimistically, it's a moment where we could choose a different trajectory of moving forward. Fundamentally, we've all lived with, and many of us continue to live with, more distanced contact and restrictive social bubbles. I know some of our European colleagues are going back into lockdown again. It may come here again, but certainly I remain highly restricted about who I can see and where I can travel and how I operate. And you know, it has an impact on all of us. But if you think about young children who thrive on social interaction, and whose development is based on social interaction, Vygotsky talks about learning is a social activity. We need to be kind of really aware that this group of children have deeply experienced. It's not that they've missed things out, but their experience has been very different. You know, and that's one of my contestations with the catch-up agenda. What are they catching with? They've experienced something that we need to know and build on and respond to. They've had a disruption, and we need to really, you know, think about that and listen to what they're saying about that disruption and act accordingly. And you know, going back to Peter's point and some of what Alison has said, there is a political side to this, because government is aware of the disruption. Government is aware that things are extraordinarily challenging, but their solution to that we need to contest. The solution of what is this recovery plan, which, if we're not careful, will lead not to the hurried child, but to the harried child. It will lead to a view that we've got to intensify and focus and narrow in order so that the children who've missed out, which I'm contesting, we need to narrow the focus on the things that they're identifying as important. And before I just wanted to flag something that I read this last week. Michael Rosen has been a consistent, ethical and principled voice during these for many years actually, but post his experience of COVID. And this last week he wrote an impassioned letter, open letter, that was published to Nadim Zahawi, asking what space there is in schools to discuss how pupils think and feel about what happened over the course of the pandemic. You know, are you at government level really thinking and talking to the children about what it's like to be them and what their experience have seen? And And this is an extract from his letter that kind of struck me as particularly pertinent. And he says, when we see children in a school playground or in a park, it's easy to imagine that the past year and a half has washed over them. They look pretty resilient. They run around, whooping and laughing. But he engaged a teacher in dialogue and says, this teacher made me think about what might be going on under the surface. And he provokes by saying, let's ask ourselves some hard questions. How many school-age children, and I'm going to say children from birth onwards, these early childhood children too, how many children have had direct experience of losing a sibling, a parent, a grandparent, a close relative or a carer? How many children are close friends with a child who has had that experience? How many children have had direct experience of people suffering the long-term effects of COVID? 100,000, 200,000, more? I ask myself and you, do we think that the effect of this can be ignored? We are, after all, talking about the psychological impact of widespread bereavement. And I think these are kind of really deep, hard, and very important questions for us to think about. And that challenge he gave to the Education Secretary, what space is there to discuss how pupils think? What space is there to be alongside children and encourage them to express how they think and feel about what has happened? We know that we are working hard in the early childhood sector to make real children's right to voice. We know that the UN Convention enshrines that in something we've signed up to. But all too often, particularly for the younger children, there's a hierarchy in listening, I think. And this right is often not realised fully. Yet we know, those of us who work with young children, we know they're absolutely capable of reflecting on their experiences and expressing in their 100 and many languages in a Malaguzzi way, the felt impact of these on their daily life and their sense of well-being. And I believe that both listening to and then the acting upon, those two things go together. It's no good listening if you don't do something with what you hear. Listening to and acting upon the perspective of these young citizens during this time, I think, is congruent with our mission of supporting inclusive, civic and democratic societies that value solidarity and the right for all to have a voice. I'd like to feel I lived in a society that was inclusive, was democratic, that really recognised the civic life and the civic right of everybody from the moment they are. And so the focus of my presentation is about capturing and promoting children's narratives about their COVID experience and provoking us to think about what we do with that. And I'm going to draw on the Froebel Young Voices on COVID project. As I said, the Trust funded us to do this piece of work. It aimed to support children and their parents, and I should also add practitioners, but I'm particularly focusing on children and to some degree their parents in this presentation, to express their narratives about their experience of the COVID pandemic during the time we were doing this, situated in the time when a lot of early childhood settings were closed, a lot of children were still in lockdown. We wanted to particularly explore the power of storytelling within a Froebelian pedagogy to promote children's social and emotional health. Think of Michael Rosen's challenge that many of them are dealing with and close to illness and bereavement, and to contain the power of storytelling to express and contain their fears and anxieties. And the third aim was to really promote children as active, feeling and thinking human beings with civic rights, civic responsibilities, and ensuring that they were listened to as we move on to think about what comes next. We worked in partnership. It was an international project in 4 different Froebelian nursery settings, all of them working in less advantaged communities in 3 different countries, England, Scotland and New Zealand. And in detail, we captured detailed narrative play sequences from 58 children. They were around 2 to 4 years of age, and 22 early years practitioners over about a 6-month period. So last year, from kind of February, March through to the autumn. All of the practitioners were Froebelian practitioners, and they all understood the Froebelian storytelling pedagogy, but we revisited that, encouraging them to think again about how their pedagogy could be developed to particularly encourage storytelling and narratives around COVID from the children. And we trained them in action research and documentation methods. Each site was supported by a pedagogic lead, and we did case studies of children. All those narratives, and they were kind of multimedia narratives using a whole range of ways to document, were collated and put together in a mosaic of stories. And then they were analysed to provide that mosaic of experience. And we looked across for key themes and saliences across the 3 study countries, New Zealand, Scotland and England. And very interestingly, they'd all had very different experiences of the pattern of the pandemic, and still do. And we looked across for commonalities and key themes, but I want to make the point that all families and all children were individual. And even within countries and within those communities, that what we became really aware of was each children's narrative, each family narrative was very, very individual and different. And some of them had had a much more positive time of this time, and some of them had had very difficult times, but all of them had had a mixture of positive and difficulty. So it was a very rich and complex picture that the narratives revealed. So I'm now going to share a little bit about the children's voices and what came out of it, because they did give us a very, very interesting insight about how the pandemic had been experienced from their perspective, and new knowledge about that, that we wouldn't have anticipated. We sometimes project what we think children's experiences were and are, but when they tell it themselves, they give you a different perspective, a different insight, and provoke us to think in new ways. And interestingly, they gave us a lot of wisdom, because young children are wise in my experience. They understand and act, I think, in a very sage way often. And we sometimes forget that they have something very positive. We as adults can learn a lot from them, and we certainly did from this project. It showed that the narrative, the whole Froebelian storytelling approach in its broadest sense, and I'm sorry I haven't got time today to tell you about the pedagogic bit, but that's been documented and you can find it in our report on the Froebel website, that storytelling is an incredibly powerful tool in helping children to express their inner life, their inner world of feelings and ideas, and being really clear that children tell their stories in many, many different ways. It's not just a spoken story, it's an acted story, and it's an expressed story. But the storytelling allows the inner to become outer and to connect their stories with other stories and the world in which they're living in. And the fundamental message that came from the children was that they do have this deep resilience, this deep way of dealing with stuff, and a sagacity in that, a wisdom in that. And that the children we were working with were taking their experiences and working with them at their own pace and in their own way. And in that way, their agency was very clear. And it was a complex, the complexity in their thinking and actions was another thing that stunned us really. It is that they were able to handle very challenging and complex experiences and feelings, not just within themselves, but also within their families and with their peers and within the community, and handle that in, I think, quite a mature and sophisticated way. So they were not only dealing with their own needs, they were often dealing with others' needs and supporting the people around them in a very constructive and positive way. And when we talk to the children about where they wanted, you know, in that expression of communality and the narratives, what became really, really clear was that when they did come back together, and of course we were working with them when they were coming back together in the nurseries, the deep, deep pleasure they had in regaining what they saw was a really important part of their daily life and routine. Their delight in being back with their peers, being back with their community in the nursery, and being back with their friends, and having a regularity to their daily life again was fundamentally important to them. They had in many ways found the disruption to that, and the not being able to come to nursery, not being able to be with their friends, not being able to be with their family, they'd found that really, really limiting and difficult. But interestingly, they'd created all kinds of strategies to manage that. They were kind of quite aware that it wasn't, you know, it wasn't normal, but they'd found a way. I remember particularly one little girl who could only see her grandmother on a Zoom, and she developed a kind of visual way of connecting with her grandmother, which was a hug. Was that she would hug herself, and then she would kind of open her hand up to do kisses. So that adaptability to find another way to make that connectivity. And when they came back into the nursery, they'd had kind of Zoom calls where they zoomed in together, those that could, by the way. There were many that couldn't, but those that could. And the practitioners have been brilliant about doing some of the welcoming routine, and the children really spontaneously. I remember one little boy sitting up high in the nursery on a kind of platform with some instruments, and doing, you know, getting everybody there to do the welcoming song, and he led the welcoming to each of the children as they went around. So this kind of real pleasure to regain their daily life and routines. But fundamentally, when we talk to young children, what they fundamentally missed was their friendships and their wider family. That became the dominant thing for them. So when we're thinking about what's important, it is about that connectivity with a wider community, their friends, the family, and the routine that being together in a civic group, which is what a nursery is really. It's a civic community with a diverse group of people, being there and negotiating that and having the routines of their daily life really, really important. The third thing we learned was that they really kind of wallowed, and I'm going to use, Tina Bruce uses the term wallowing in their play, but having extended time. Interestingly, while the lockdown and you know, the disruption was going on, Ofsted inspections had been suspended, but also some of the requirements of the EYFS, the Early Years Foundation Stage framework in England, had been suspended during this time. And it was interesting, Alison, talking about the freedom to use time, but the practitioners talked to us about the liberation with their daily programs and routines. They felt freer to give children much more extended time to play and be together. And the whole focus of this project was to work with them to extend those play experiences and to enable the children to play out and express and play together and express together what these last months were and what their preoccupations were. And many of them did choose to play out their COVID experience. We had death games, and we had hospital games, and we had injections, and we had TV screens where they pretended to be Boris Johnson doing his daily, the whole gamut was there. But having this time to play and not the pressure to deliver something, but to just enable things. I like that sense of the in-between time, that time to just be there and let things play out in its own time. And if they wanted to express it, they could, and if they didn't, they didn't. But but we found, and the practitioners found, that during this time they felt they could and should give children more extended time to play, and the play changed in nature with that freedom. It became deeper and more complex, and deeper in the sense that the children developed over days and sometimes over weeks, and quite deep and continued themes of what was going on at home, what was going on in. They were also very well aware of the national discourse and what was happening out there, and they really did take these themes into their play and express them. The fourth thing that was really strong was the real power, and I don't want to particularly use the term therapy, but the whole being out of doors, both the practitioners and parents and children, changed the way they were together in the day. The outdoors became much more important to them. For the parents and the practitioners, they felt safer, I think, when they were in the outdoor environment. So often the interaction with parents was done in the garden, but the practitioners talked about starting the pedagogy outside and then maybe going inside, rather than being inside and then going outside. They'd reverse that because they felt everything felt better out of doors. And interestingly, the children in our studies were generally given the freedom to be indoors or outdoors, but the vast majority of the time, given the freedom to choose, the children chose outdoors and were outdoors. And remember, some of this was in quite challenging weather as well. But they seem to be drawn, and there's something, you know, very deep in Froebel, but that romantic movement about nature teaching you, and nature being a kind of therapy for you, and the seasonality that they became much more aware of, and a lot of the deeper play went on outdoors as well. So the real significance of being out of doors rather than indoors and in a contained, you know, man-made or human-made environment, we should say. Again, that's provoked and provokes us to think about where our pedagogy happens and where the deep stuff happens. And the final thing I want to say from the children was that they desperately wanted information, and real, authentic information. They wanted to know about the coronavirus. They wanted to know about the spread of infection. They could use those words of, you know, sanitization and coronavirus, and they loved and model make around the structure of the molecules. You know, that they were hungry. They didn't need to be protected from what was going on. They listened, and they were aware often, both in New Zealand and Scotland and England, about the national broadcasts that were going on. And they would tell us about that and act it out in their play and handle that. So we didn't find there was a need to kind of protect them from things. They needed to know, and they wanted to know that something major was going on, and that they were in that discourse and understanding that narrative. And that was true of children in all the countries. So really big messages that came out of that. I'm quickly going to say something about the parent voices, because as I said earlier, that you know, all of us and the parents of these children were no different to others. There were big challenges and worries, and here's just some of them, and I'm not going to go through them, but there were, some families had come under huge pressure and stress, and you know, became very vulnerable for many reasons during this time. That it was a very difficult time for some families, and particularly different in some of the communities we were working with. But interestingly, when we talked to them, they would also weave, even where it had been really difficult, the parents would weave some positives in it. And some of this links with what the whole theme of today is about, which is why I wanted to bring it in. They had experienced and appreciated that they'd had more time together as a family. They talked about the slower pace of life, the appreciation, the time they'd had with their children to appreciate nature and the seasons. They felt this time together had strengthened relationships, that they'd had time to have a dialogue, to have a deep and authentic dialogue as a family about risk and crisis. And interestingly, they generally ended up with a kind of optimism. We've learned from this, so let's move on. And that's how I want to be. I want to be optimistic about the future. And as Michael Rosen says, let's pause and reflect and think what needs to change. So the legacy learning, the first thing I want to say is, children have such a valuable and important voice for us, and we need to, as a practice community and as a research community, really listen well and learn and co-construct together. And the deep value of play and storytelling, both for children's development and well-being, but also for informing us about their lives and what works for them. But the big message linked to this is the message from the children and their families was that they felt that it had given us the opportunity to slow down, listen more to children particularly, the benefits of having time together and encouragement to be outside. I think we have become a very contained and inside, many of us live our lives in buildings and we should be outside more. The value of more regular contact and dialogue with parents who understand children well and the context of them. But really the benefits of a slower pace of life, both in the nursery and at home. Slow pedagogy, and I don't think that's just about when they're in the kindergarten and when they're in the nursery. I think it's about a life that it really provokes us to think about time and how we spend our time in a different way. So the challenges of slow, and this is really a Froebelian phrase. He challenged us way back to respond actively and authentically to what the children, and I've added the parents, are saying. And he says it will be a test of our judgment and our feelings too. Our generation will be judged on what we do next. And I hope all of us would be positive and have an advocacy role to make sure these children's voices and our voices in early childhood are not lost in that. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was a brilliant presentation, and thank you to Alison as well. So we've got 20 minutes now just to go through some questions. I've been making notes myself, and we've got a few questions in the Q&A function. The first one that came through was for Alison. How can leaders adopt a slower approach when Ofsted and the government are continually pressuring schools to perform at a rate or way that is not equal to what children learn best? Particularly in light of the pandemic, the restart of inspections are not recognising the impact of the pandemic on children's well-being and mental health, and of course that of the staff. What can be done to challenge the government to realise that we need to slow down more than ever? Big question.
Big question, and very, very important issues. And that's obviously the reality for many people in different early childhood education contexts, particularly in England at the moment. And I think this debate is not intended to put more pressure on really pressured, hurried educators, but I think it is an attempt to point out that there are alternatives that the early childhood education field hold very dear, and to point out that if we don't speak of the alternatives, then there will never be a change, and the highly measured measurement culture will just continue its grip. So I think voicing alternatives is important. I think it's around pointing out the direction that we would like the field to be able to move in, and to have that kind of collective confidence to say, actually, these are the values that we hold dear, and this is what we believe for young children that they need in terms of the emphasis on play. And then I'd point to, I think it begins with moments, and I think what we'll see from Gemma after the break will be an example of starting in one particular moment in the day and seeing what happens when you enable that moment, that meal time, to have more meaning, really.
Thank you for that, Alison. I really like what you're saying about starting with moments there. Chris, I don't know if you want to come in on that as well, because you also spoke about maybe reaching out to decision makers and the political side of all of this. I wonder what your views would be on that.
I mean, I think it is part of what we have to do. We have to respond and advocate, and you know, I always say there's nothing so political as early childhood, because it's shaping society and reflects our, you know, our civic values. I talked a lot about civic society, and we live in a democracy, so voice should be there. I do recognise the issues that are coming through inspection and the EOS, but again, I'm trying to be relentlessly optimistic and positive. It's down to us. We all live in a society where we have a voice. I think we need to connect together and work together. And I know Shadow Work, you know, the coalition is the Birth to Five Minds is a big moment for us to kind of come together and document that. The new framework, the new EVIFS, and this is only an English thing, but in a way, because it has liberated in some ways, it doesn't define the pedagogy anymore. It used to. Now, you know, I could be quite angry about that, because where's play? It's not, you know, it's not a statutory requirement anymore. But what it says is practitioners have the opportunity and should make their decisions about what kind of pedagogy they operate now. It's supposed to take the pressure off, but also encourage practitioners to articulate and promote and experiment with different pedagogies. So again, that's an opportunity. If we come together and if we think together and if we have rich dialogues in our settings, you know, when Ofsted comes, we need to be able to articulate and express and say what our pedagogy is and why. So again, you know, there is an opportunity there if we're smart and if we have these deep, you know, these deep conversations about why we're doing what we're doing and why it's right for those children and how it supports their development, and particularly their personal, social, and emotional development at this time. I think we ought to be able to defend it and introduce slower pedagogies, because the evidence is there, and it's internationally, that parents want it, that children want it, you know, that it benefits children. So yeah, you know, let's use this opportunity to articulate and try out a different kind of pedagogy and a different kind of discourse about it.
I really like that, Chris. It's about giving agency to settings, isn't it, to follow their own approach. Thank you for that. Alison, we've got a few questions about cultural differences across countries. And what came out for me was the differences between, you know, the context in Japan and what that might look like compared to Denmark and compared to the UK. I wonder if you noticed any differences in the practitioner responses there and what they were talking about in terms of their slow pedagogies according to those cultural differences.
Thank you, Shadow. Yes, I think so. With this study has just been a sort of dipping a toe in the water, really. So I've been talking to researchers and educators, and it's been what I call a purposive sample. So it's been looking at where these slow practices have been happening. But I think my general impression is that so if I take the Japan example, the wider cultural and political frame does have such a bearing on what happens within individual settings, and so these are big societal issues around the hurried child, and they do pose issues around. It takes us right back to what do we see? What is education about? What are our values? I think it was interesting talking to my Danish colleagues, how hearing that the early childhood practice there has been so much more agency given to educators to form their policies, that actually I could have a strong sense of this confidence, the professional confidence, to say actually this is important, agency given to the children is important, play is so important. So I think the obviously the policy framework and then the professional confidence of educators is key.
Yeah, thank you for that, Alison. And Chris, with your research, a similar question really. I think you noticed lots of similarities between New Zealand, Scotland, and England. Would that be fair to say?
I mean, the children, you know, and the storytelling and the expression, all of that was similar. I think it was the context that were different, because New Zealand was experiences and being politically led very differently. Scotland was different, and England was. So it was really the wider context and the support that was given at a policy level that and the patterns of how the pandemic that impacted differently. And I think that the wider cultural context does matter, actually. You know, I know, for example, in Scotland, as we move forward, the new Scotland is much more embracing play and promoting play as the vehicle for well-being and learning and development. Whereas it's not in the same way. We're not told in England that we can't do it, but we're not kind of encouraged to either. It's kind of an open space, which is both an opportunity but also a kind of a bit of a worry. New Zealand, you know, very, very much into, you know, again, a different cultural context, but very much into a different way of being. We were working particularly in the Maori community there. And of course, the whole cultural context of the natural world and outdoors is fundamentally differently perceived and therefore expressed through art or you know, music or you know, and therefore in the children's play as well. So, you know, there were a lot of similarities that, you know, in the end, we're all human beings living on a planet. So that's what binds us together. I think there's more in common than separates. But we all live in a particular context, don't we? And they're different. And I also wanted to say that those cultural differences are both within societies as well. You know, even within the nurseries, some of the children's home and cultures were very different. So, and that's the joy of it, isn't it? The complexity of it. Yeah. But, you know, always I think there's more that binds us together than separates us. I like to think that anyway.
Hope so. Thank you for that, Chris. And I think what you were talking about there in terms of the Scottish approach is really interesting, particularly in terms of their focus on outdoor play. Alison, in your research, you were calling for a bit more of an ecological approach to slow pedagogy. I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
So I think that word has many different meanings, but I think the relationship with the natural world and but also in a sort of social cultural sense as well, the importance of those wider relationships in learning. So yeah, and I too have been really fascinated by the realising the ambition and the current direction that the Scottish early years field is moving in, which I think has big lessons for many other contexts. Yeah,
absolutely. I'm going to take another question from the Q&A function. Is there an overview of commonalities to the physical impact of the pandemic? Are they individual to each community? Some things that I have experienced include delay in developmental social stages, fear of communal areas. Explaining these in layman's terms is a challenge. However, I've tried to reassure each family that their child is normal and that their right stage of development is, and that they're at the right stage of development, whatever that is. I wonder if you have any reflections or comments on that in terms of the physical impact on COVID, in terms of different communities and how we can reassure parents, perhaps, based on that. Chris, I'll come to you first.
I mean, I think the one thing, and it's in the chat, I just noticed something, and it came out of our study, that when you work really in an open way with parents and really have regular ongoing, and one of the positives had been that the connectivity between practitioners and parents had deepened and changed actually in the 3-4 communities we were looking at. You know, a closer relationship as they'd worked together to work through how they were going to manage this had developed, and parents you know, we're working in this triad together with the practitioners and the children about it, and because of that, I think the parents, because the children had time to observe their children and be with their children and see what they could do a little bit more, so they appreciated that a bit more. And I think the practitioners had more contact with parents, so understood what home situations. So I think it is about that relationship and working together with parents. Parents, in my experience, when you work respectfully with them and in a nuanced way with them, they get it mostly, and they can be the best advocate, actually. You know, they get it in a way that policy makers and politicians don't. So maybe that's the place to start with that. But certainly there are some children who's had their development and learning disrupted, if I like to put it like that. But I really want to kind of say that it's not that they haven't developed or learned during this time. They have. But they've learned different things, and isn't the role of a pedagogue to build on that, and to, you know, that social is to work with that, and to give them those experiences, more time for those experiences that they've missed. Mostly it's been about the social and emotional disruption, because that's not good for anybody to be isolated in the way that many of us have been. And so where the challenges are, I think, is because the children haven't had time to be with and alongside other children and their extended family in the way that they would have done previously.
Thank you for that, Chris. Alison, there's a question in the chat about the focus of today is, of course, on children in the early years, but how might we support children in reception year 1 and year 2? I guess more broadly, childhood in the UK, you know, we have a very young school starting age. So is your argument for slow pedagogy maybe an argument for raising the school age or extending childhood in the UK? We've seen a lot of that in the Scottish context, where there's calls for a kindergarten stage from 3 to 7. I wonder what your views would be on that.
Well, I think my personal emphasis is in looking at what actually happens in the school system, rather than necessarily putting all the emphasis on the raising the school starting age. I think it's about the opportunities that the children have within that context. But I think there's so much more that could happen in terms of a more play-based pedagogy within the school context, within those classrooms. And I think this question about transition as well, which I kind of touched on a little bit. I mean, how much of children's lives within the school system is kind of foreshadowed by what we're preparing the children for, rather than celebrating the here and now, and I think that's a big challenge.
Thank you for that, Alison. Chris, just a question on the COVID context and your research and speaking with children and practitioners. Was there any resistance to maybe talking with children about the effects of the last year or so in terms of COVID and issues of death and bereavement? And how might we equip practitioners to be able to speak with children with regard to those kind of psychological effects that children may have experienced?
Yeah, I mean, look, we didn't find any resistance, no, but we did find that the practitioners were sometimes a bit shocked about, because these were quite young children, 3-year-olds, some of them. And you know, I recall in one nursery, this game that the children developed, that the children called it the death game. And really what they did was act out a parent becoming ill and coughing and then going to bed and then being tended to and then dying. And this game was with a small group of children. It was a game they kept returning to again and again. And then practitioners got concerned about that. And the other thing that concerned the practitioners was the children seemed to want to play that game out of sight of the adults, away from the adults. So the practitioners reflected with us about, did the children think we couldn't cope with them you know, the game was kind of too difficult for the adults to deal with, or was it that the children, it was a private thing that they needed to work out for themselves, and the practitioners were worried that they'd kind of, you know, made a context where it wasn't okay for the children to bring in these difficult things, so they did it but they did it away from the adults. So they were having those deep conversations about, and maybe it was all right for children to have narratives that they wanted to explore by themselves as children without the adults. And the adults, in the end, practitioners, just felt that they should give spaces and places and time for the children to bring things in it or not. And there were other children who chose not to bring the COVID stuff in. It was like, no, I'm back with my friends and I'm back in, I want my normal life, and I don't want to, I've had enough of that, I want to play superheroes, or, you know, and that, so it was really creating an environment that was open for the children to bring in what they wanted to do in the way they wanted to do it, when they wanted to do it. But they certainly did bring in difficult illnesses, bereavements and stuff. And the practitioners that we work with were not, or the parents, I don't think the parents worried about it. I think they felt very positive that the children, you know, were engaging in the reality of what was there. And I think I said about them not being needed to be protected from things, but being supported in that, because they were in a very, when they were in nursery, they were in a very, a Froebelian nursery is a very supportive environment. These were skilled practitioners. So I have to say this was a kind of particular group of nurseries and practitioners who were highly skilled and understood the need to not shy away from these difficult issues. How global that is, I don't know. But surely we should be in environments where the expression of all feelings, the whole gamut of feelings, from despondency to joy, should be, you know, part of what daily life is about. That's what makes a good life, I think, together. And that's what we're trying to create, an authentic good life together.
Yeah, Alison, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just quickly, just to say about the Play Observatory project that Kate Cowan and John Potter have been leading, and that has aimed to gather as many different children's narratives around their play during the pandemic. And I think that will be a really important archive, because also drawing on Michael Rosen, it also says, let's look at this knowledge that the children have accumulated and to celebrate that.
Thank you, Alison and Chris. I can see Peter back on the screen now. So
yes,
the Time Lord. The yes. Time Lord is.
I'm afraid I'm the fast element in this slow exercise. I feel very. I feel very embarrassed, but however, it is my role to bring this first part of the webinar to an end. I think we've had a splendid start, or a splendid first part, and thank you both Alison and Chris, also Shadai, for managing the questions so deftly. Absolutely. So we all have a break now. Can you remember to log off and then log back onto the new link at 11:10 so that we can start promptly at 11:15. So see you all again in 15 minutes. And once again, thank you all for an excellent first part. Bye.